Well, why don't we get started? People will keep, straggling in as we go. But I'm just going to take a few minutes. I'm going to try to be brief here and kind of land us in the room together for this time, this brief time that we have. So welcome everyone. My name is Asher Miller. I'm the Executive Director of Post Carbon Institute, the host of today's conversation. Thank you all for joining us, and thanks to David Montgomery and Bianca Moebius-Clune for joining me for this, which is this is the first of a two-part webinar series that we're going to be hosting on soil. Today, Bianca and David are going to help us get the lay of the land, so to speak, on the importance of soil, the major challenges that we face due to topsoil loss and degradation, and broadly what we can do to address these issues. The second webinar will take place at the same day, same time next week, so a week from today, and we'll get more deeply into ways that people can and are regenerating the world beneath our feet. So before we begin today, I just want to do some very quick housekeeping. We do hope to have time at the end for a Q&A. I'm afraid we won't have time to respond to everyone's questions. We've already gotten more than 100 people who submitted questions in advance through the survey that we put out. Thank you for that. And we've done our best to sort of review those and incorporate them into the conversation for today. But if you have a question that you'd like us to address, you can submit it by typing into the Q&A window. We'll also be sharing some resources, I think, in the chat window as well. Both of these can be accessed by clicking on the buttons at the bottom of your screen. So we have just under 75 minutes together to cover a lot of ground. So in the interest of time, I'm going to do very brief introductions and suggest that folks check out both Bianca and David's work online. So Dr. Bianca Moebius-Clune is the director of American Farmland Trust National Climate Initiative. Her program works collaboratively across partners and stakeholders to scale successful approaches, on-ramp new innovations, quantify outcomes, and reach new audiences for impact across landowners, partners, researchers, and policymakers to achieve resilient, healthy soils and climate-smart regenerative agriculture and food systems. And David Montgomery is a geologist who studies landscape evolution and the effects of geological processes on ecological systems and human societies. He's written a number of popular science books, 3 of which won the Washington State Book Award. His recent book, Growing Revolution, Bringing Our Soil Back to Life, focused on the potential for regenerative farming practice to reshape agriculture. And coming out, I think, next week is What Your Food Ate, How to Heal Our Land and Reclaim Our Health, co-authored with Anne Biklé, which explores the link between soil health and human health. So thank you both for being here. I really appreciate it. And now, without further ado, I'd like to start with you, Bianca. And maybe you can help orient us. Can you talk about why soil health matters so much, and maybe provide a quick snapshot of what's happening with soil, particularly here in the United States?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. Soil health is near and dear to my heart. I have been working on soil health for the last 20 years now, and it's been exciting and insightful, and there's a lot of amazing stuff going on across the country and across the world. So we're facing some pretty serious challenges as a human race on this planet, right? I mean, we're facing a changing climate. We're facing population growth. We're facing food security issues. We're facing issues with water quantity, water quality, air quality, human health, the loss of agricultural soils to development, to degradation, to salinization, now to the loss due to sea level rise. And these are some pretty serious issues, and we could get pretty depressed about them and bury our heads in the sand. But that's not what we're going to do here today, because I think both David and I are here to say, soils are at the foundation of everything that keeps us alive, and they embody a win-win solution that can contribute to solving a lot of these issues. No one thing is ever the solution, right? We're not going to tell you it's a silver bullet, but soils, there's a lot that we can do, and it's really exciting. Soils, in essence, keep us all alive and well-resourced, right? At the foundation of a society are functioning soils, and David describes that really excellently in his first book that I actually used in a class that I taught at Cornell University before going on to direct the soil health division at NRCS. And there we define soil health as the capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans, which is to say it sustains us all, right? Soils grow what we need, our crops, our livestock, our fuel, everything that we need, forests for building our materials. But aside from sort of the more selfish, how does it keep us alive, right? It's keeping everything on this planet alive, and so we need to keep our soils functioning and healthy. And what we're finding is that farmers can actually do that. Farmers can be a solution for climate change, for all of these other issues, by transitioning to practices that work to keep our soils healthy. And we do that basically by building soils that provide habitat for soil organisms to thrive. So take a handful of soil, I don't know where you all are across the country, across the world, take any handful of soil, there will be more organisms in that handful of soil than there are people on Earth. So that's a mega city, and those organisms keep that soil functioning. So that's a critical message that I want you all to walk away with, because when you understand that every time you walk out there, every time you're on soil, it's not just a surface you're walking on, it's a mega city, it's a three-dimensional space, it is a world of its own that's got all these organisms. And every farmer, and I would say every gardener, everybody who does anything with soil, really you're a livestock grower, your livestock are microscopic, okay? So a little bit of a paradigm shift here, and that means everybody can do something for their soils that they care for, even if it's just in your plant pot, right? And everybody can support agriculture. So your other question was, well, what has happened to our soils? And I'm going to briefly share my screen here and give you a little bit of a view of the downward spiral that has happened with our soils in this nation. And we're in some serious predicaments, but the good news is that farmers are actually making it out of that. We have had a situation where, with the kind of disturbance, the lack of soil cover that is most of conventional agriculture, the reduced rooting, because you harvest that corn crop in September, October, November, and then the soil is bare. There's nothing growing, feeding those organisms until the next crop gets planted the next year, right? So we're not feeding those organisms. Our biodiversity is decreasing. Our agriculture is not very diverse. Vast areas of the country are one crop for a whole year, and that's it. As that has happened, we have had to deal with the consequences. And those consequences are that we're losing our organic matter. That means we're increasing erosion. We get more compacted, harder soils. As that happens, there's less of that biological activity. The aggregate stability, the stability of that house that keeps those microbes well resourced, that stability is falling apart. Our soils are falling apart. That means we have more crusting, more surface compaction. And guess what? When we get that, we don't get as much infiltration of the rain that happens. That means we get less drainage. That means we get more erosion. That also means we get more flooding. So when you see flooding at the bottom of a watershed, that means that entire watershed is letting a lot of water not infiltrate, right? It's where the raindrop hits the soil. If it goes in, it's not going to turn into a flood. If you get an accumulation of a lot of water in a rainstorm that doesn't go into the soil, that's where flooding occurs. So as that happens, we lose even more organic matter. We lose a lot of our nutrients. We lose a lot of our topsoil. We get more ponding. We get less water storage, interestingly. We get less nutrient availability for our crops. We get more pests. We get more diseases. And a whole range of issues happen in our agriculture. For us in this country, it tends to be that our crop yields decline, that the consistency declines. We experience more risk of farmers are having to buy more inputs. So farm economic viability goes down. Across much of the world, there are also results of hunger and malnutrition. We don't have to deal with that as much in this country, at least not as a result to specific soil degradation. It's more of a distribution issue. But in much of the world, I've experienced families in Madagascar, in Kenya, whose soils were very degraded, and so they were not able to feed themselves as well and as consistently. So that's what's happening with a lot of our soils, but there is hope, and we'll talk about that today, because there are many farmers, and increasingly many more farmers, who are doing things differently and who are rebuilding the health of their soil, the function of their soil. I'll end it at that for the moment.
Thanks, Bianca. That's a really great orientation, I think, to not only why soil is important, but also kind of what's been happening with our soil situation, soil health situation. Dave, maybe you could talk a little bit about the role that soil has played in the rise and fall of previous societies. I think this is something that people don't tend to think about. But as you've written about extensively, it's a hugely important issue.
Remember to unmute myself there. Yeah, it's one of those, that's really the question that got me involved in thinking about soils in the first place. Because, my background and training is as a geologist, so I'm used to looking backwards through long stretches of time. And I was very interested back in the mid 1990s in writing about the role that soil erosion had played in past societies and civilizations. And that's not a terribly new idea. You can trace people talking about that all the way back to the Greek philosopher Plato. But it's the kind of issue, sort of the state of our land and the state of our soil and the role of how we treat it in turn affects us and our descendants, that is not often given the attention that it needs or deserves, because soil degradation happens fairly slowly most of the time, over generations. And as a species, we tend to be pretty good and hardwired at dealing with the immediate problem right in front of us, and pretty good at putting off and off and off and off the problems that don't become the crisis du jour. And soil degradation and erosion has been that way through society after society. But also because a lot of the action is happening below ground. All that life that Bianca was talking about in terms of soil health. And how many of us, have thought about soil as having health? That's kind of a new idea in the last few decades, again, with roots that go back much longer into history. But it's an important idea to put to forefront today into thinking about farming for reasons that Bianca and I will undoubtedly be talking more about today. But the connection to past societies is that, my background and training was on studying natural processes of soil erosion. So I thought about writing a book about, what about when people get involved? And how has that affected societies? And by the end of writing Dirt, The Erosion of Civilizations, I realized I'd written a history of farming. It wasn't so much a history of erosion as was a history of farming. And why is that? Because, the act of plowing, one of the iconic acts of agriculture in many parts of the world, disturbing the ground to plant and grow our crops, is something that is a very unnatural act. I mean, how many places do you go in a native grassland or a native forest and you see vast tracts of bare earth outside of like really arid areas where there just aren't many plants to begin with? It's not common. Nature tends to clothe herself in plants, and there's a long-term symbioses, mutually beneficial relationships that have developed between life in the soil and plants that can capture solar energy and turn it, combine CO2 from the atmosphere with water through photosynthesis to make more plant matter. And plants eventually die, and when the plants die, that organic matter can build up healthier, more organic matter rich soils, which can help feed life below ground, particularly life like fungi, which can't photosynthesize, or bacteria in the soil. If they're living below ground, they're out, they can't photosynthesize either if they're shielded from solar radiation and they don't have the right genes. But that organic matter can feed that life in the soil, which in many ways serves as nature's recycling and reprovisioning service. You can think of fungi in the soil as something that is specialized at pulling mineral elements out of soil particles and degrading soil organic matter, and really repurposing what was once alive into materials that can be used to create new life. And that cycle, that grand cycle of nutrient provisioning and reallocation, is something that really keeps terrestrial ecosystems going. Soils are the foundation for terrestrial ecosystems. And what I learned in writing Dirt was that the disturbance of the soil over the long run, maintained over generations of farming practices, can degrade soil organic matter and result in soil loss that in any one year can be fairly minor, but if maintained year after year can really add up. And there's whole regions of the Roman heartland and the Greek heartland from classical Greece where the soil is literally stripped off of hillsides, and that it impaired the ability of those societies to continue feeding their population into the future. And it's not just a problem of ancient history. I mean, the American Southeast, the Piedmont country from Virginia down to Alabama, that hill country has lost most of its topsoil in historical times, the last couple hundred years. And that's the story that I put together in writing about Dirt, because soil erosion and degradation has been one of the most impactful but most neglected elements of human history since the last ice age. And dirt was my attempt to basically shine a light on that and illustrate how important maintaining the fertility and productivity, the health of our soil is for human societies, for human health writ broadly, this health of whole societies. And you can think of it in a fairly simple way, where if you think about the ratio of the human population to the amount of fertile land that population has access to, as we degrade our land, we're reducing the amount of fertile land, and as our population grows, we're putting greater demands on that land. And as population grows and the supply of fertile soil goes down, we either have to farm more intensively and get more out of the smaller areas of land, or we have to figure out ways to sustain the fertility of the land and rebuild it back. And that's where I think there's cause for optimism looking forward. Because as Bianca was talking about, and that I've written about in Growing a Revolution, there's ways to farm that build the health and fertility of the land, that can produce copious harvests that can feed sizable populations comparable to the kind of harvest we get today, but that do it with very different methods, very different techniques, and and as importantly, are more sustainable than what we now call conventional farming practices, which rely greatly on tillage, plowing, which degrades soil organic matter over time and leaves the land vulnerable to erosion by wind or rain, by the over-reliance on synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, which influences the life in the soil, which influences soil health, and by specializing in functional monocultures, just growing one or two main crops on a farm, which there turns out it can also compromise the long-term health and fertility of the land in ways that I'm sure we'll get into a little bit more in a minute. But basically, the backstory of human civilizations since the last ice age has been one in terms of increasingly intensive farming practices on land that leads to their degradation. And you can think of the state of the soil as what sets the stage upon which history plays out. And a society that has a lot of fertile land and very few people is poised to grow. And a society that has more people than its land can feed is a society that's getting into trouble. And that's the story I put together in Dirt, and why a geologist would think to write about soil when I was taught by my professors that it was the stuff that covered up the rocks. And it's stuff we needed to dig through to get to the good stuff. But I've been reformed. I've seen the light, and I think there are very few issues as important today as really bringing our soil back to life and restoring the health and fertility of the world's farmlands, as a gift for future generations of humanity. We need to think that way.
Just briefly, is it fair to say, I mean, looking at past societies, the story of their relationship with soil was localized, right? And in most cases, is it fair to say that we're dealing with a different reality now in terms of, I mean, is it something that we're seeing as an issue facing societies and nations across the planet? Is it something that you see as still as a localized issue?
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting lessons from looking back at the history of societies and the way they've treated their land is that regional societies that have degraded their land have either had to move on to new land, or they essentially are but a shadow of their former selves. And there's examples of both in different parts of the world. And there's a few examples of societies that actually took pretty good care of their land, and managed to thrive for long periods of time. And I go all into that in the book. But the reality is today that we've degraded somewhere between like a quarter and a third of the world's potential agricultural land, to the point where it's been taken out of agricultural production, and much of the rest of the world's farmland has been somewhat degraded, degraded enough to actually impact yields. And we rely today greatly on mechanical methods and agrochemical methods to maintain the productivity of our farmland. But those methods are ones that run right into the climate problem in terms of being very much dependent on fossil fuel use for diesel and for synthetic fertilizer production. And we really need to explore ways at a global level to maintain intensive agricultural production with less reliance on climate damaging methods and technologies, and in ways that actually preserve and, if not build, the ability of the land to feed more people into the future. So I think we're really at a pivotal point in human development this century, where we've basically got the balance of this century, at least a few decades, or the balance of this century, to really solve the problem of conventional agriculture, which is that it degrades the soil. And it's a problem that needs to be prioritized because we don't have any place to move on to after, we're an integrated global society and we're degraded land all around the world. And we basically need to reverse that because there's nowhere else to go once we degrade the soil on this planet. You look at the soils on Mars, we are not going to be farming Mars, no matter who Elon Musk gets up there in the near future. We're not going to be farming on Mars in a way that'll feed a lot of people. We need to basically solve the soil degradation problem on this planet, simultaneously with the climate problem.
And that's a great segue to something I wanted to talk to you about, Bianca, and that is this relationship? Maybe you could talk about the relationship between soil and carbon and climate change. Kind of do it for a dummy like me. Oh, you're muted. Yeah.
It would help if I unmuted. There we go. Yes, absolutely. And that question, I will give it the very rough once over short version, and it's a topic that we could get into for hours, days, weeks, entire graduate level courses. There's a lot to it. The International Panel on Climate Change, a large group of scientists, puts out regular reports, and basically where we're at right now is we have already on average raised the temperature of Earth 1.1 degrees Celsius, which may not sound like much, but basically the predictions right now, the best understanding of our scientists across the world is that if we get past 1.5 degrees Celsius, we are in for some really serious irreversible impacts, because at that point we influence all of the ecosystems, all of our agriculture, all of how we grow food, our water cycling, our ocean temperatures, and how those cycle. So major impacts that we will not know how to reverse. So the time to act is now, and already we are feeling those disproportionate impacts. And agriculture in particular, our farmers and ranchers are really hurting with excessive heat, with fires, wildfires that are happening because of climate change, with wetter wets and drier dries, issues like a blueberry farmer reporting in one of our 15 Farm Bill workshops that American Farmland Trust did earlier this season. A blueberry farmer said basically he lost 70% of his crop because of a heat wave. People are getting so much rain that they're losing crops. Tomato grower losing 40% of their crop. Greenhouses not really working, vegetables bolting when they're not supposed to because of the shifts in temperature. And we're having massive problems even producing the crops that we usually would right now. And farmers are having a hard time predicting which crops will do well, when is a good time to plant, or not able to get into the ground to plant because it's so wet that you just can't get the crop planted, right? So the time to act is now, right? So there's the climate issue, and we need to stop emissions before we get past that point where we have irreversible change. Now, the good news is that as of recent science, it used to be that it was thought that, well, if we stop emissions, then the warming will still continue for decades. And so what's the hope, right? There's no hope. Well, there is hope, because as of what is known today, if we stop emissions, the warming is predicted to stop about a couple of years, 3 to 5 years after that. That's really good news. That's really new news, right? So we can do something about it. That means we'd really better all of us get on it in whatever way we can right away. Now, climate change, just sort of at the very basic level, is caused by greenhouse gases that we are creating as a human race beyond what is sort of our normal Earth cycling. The primary greenhouse gases are CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. And agriculture contributes in the United States about 10% of that, globally more than that. And the key is right now, agriculture is still one of the many problems contributing. Many other sectors contribute much more: transportation, industry, development. Develop a piece of land and it will emit 50 to 70 times more greenhouse gases than when it was agriculture, right? So we need to not develop our best farmland because we need it to produce food, and we don't want it to emit more greenhouse gases, right? But agriculture right now is still a problem. American Farmland Trust is working really hard in the ways that we can as a national nonprofit to influence that and hopefully get agriculture to go to climate neutral or better. That's a lofty goal, but it's really critical, it's really urgent, and there's space in it for everybody to work on that. So there's climate change in a nutshell. Now, how does that relate to carbon? Well, for one, carbon is one of, is part of two of those gases, right? Methane and CO2 both have carbon in them. We don't want those in the air. Is there more carbon today than there was in the 1500s? No, we have the same amount of carbon on our planet. The problem is that now it's a gas. So much of it was in the earth before in the form of soil carbon. We've lost about half of our soil carbon, and in the form of fossil fuels that were prehistoric plants, right? So we've now made that into a gas. It's time to put it back. The IPCC is very, very adamant that natural working lands, our farms, our ranches, our forests, need to be part of the solution. They are often forgotten as we're working on renewable fuels, but we need to use all of the land available across the globe to sequester carbon because there's too much of it in the air, and these are inexpensive solutions. So that's where that connection is in terms of climate change, carbon, soil. Our soils have a huge capacity to sequester and maintain more of that carbon. We can put a lot of that carbon back in. And we're going to talk a bit about how it is that we do that. When it comes to soils, carbon is the basic building block of life in those soils, and it influences water, nutrient, oxygen cycling. And of course, all of those are components of plants as well. And we really need to work on managing those systems in a way that they are more effective again at bringing that carbon back in and at emitting less of the methane, right? So feed management and manure management of livestock are the big levers there. And then nitrous oxide, most of our nitrous oxide emissions, especially in this country, are from corn agriculture using more nitrogen than is actually necessary, and that's where the losses happen. So there are a lot of technologies, they're available right now. The good news is there's actually a lot of farmers that are currently already sequestering more carbon and restoring the functioning of our soils. Some of my colleagues at ARS and AFT have made some estimates that cropland is actually already sequestering 134 million metric tons of CO2 per year through those various practices on cropland. And that's just cropland, right? So we're already sequestering a lot, but there's a lot more to go because agriculture is still emitting a lot. Globally, our soils store 2 to 3 times more carbon than the atmosphere, and 4 times more carbon than is in vegetation, right? So it's a huge potential sink. We need to use it as that. And right now, existing literature, the science out there, and the experience of our farmers and ranchers says that yes, regenerative agriculture practices that we're going to talk about here a lot do sequester carbon and are useful in combating climate change. And those practices are relatively cost effective and rely on current technology, current knowledge that's actually out there and that can be adopted by farmers. And that's the exciting part. I mean, we need to do more than that, right? There's a lot of different things that we need to do. There's a lot of great technologies being developed to, to use engineering to suck carbon out of the air. That's great. But what we have right now is very basic photosynthesis, and we can manage our landscapes to photosynthesize more for more of the year using the soil health management principles. Having plants, roots in the ground year round is absolutely critical, and managing those plants in a way where they can really proliferate, where they can really grow a lot of carbon, getting that back in the soil, finding ways to stabilize that carbon, right? There are issues with really making sure that carbon stays in the ground. Once you sequester it, there's a lot of times that folks will say, well, what if the farmer stops no-tilling? What if the farmer stops using cover crops? Well, then you've lost all that, right? But what we're actually finding is that farmers that change to these practices see so many win-win benefits for their economics, for the resilience of their yields, for the diversity of crops that they can now sell. There are so many benefits to adopting these systems once they're really well-adapted systems that farmers stick with them. Many farmers have said, no, I would never go back. This is how things need to be. And people are seeing, and I think the average person is seeing also, more and more, we're recognizing that the way our food is grown has a huge impact on climate, has a huge impact on water quality and all of these other things. And we can actually make choices just by the food that we eat. So that's another important piece there. So I think I'll end there to make sure that we have time for other questions, but there's a lot to be done, really exciting. I hope that kind of broadly covered those three connections.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I just want to just flag that it seems like there's been some confusion around or debate around the role, that soil and agriculture can play as like a climate solution in terms of sequester. So it seems like there's probably not like a definitive, simple, answer, yes or no, but just what's your response to that for folks who are kind of confused in terms of hearing different narratives around this question right now?
That's a great question. I can flag a few things. One is in terms of, is it a potential solution? Yes, absolutely. I mean, just looking at the amount of land that's available to sequester more carbon, there's an estimated well over 170 million acres in the US of cropland that's still available for conversion to no-till because it hasn't been adopted yet. A lot of farmers have adopted no-till, but there's still a lot of ways to go. In terms of cover cropping, we're still at about 5 or 6% adoption of cover cropping. And so there's a lot of acres, most of our acres left to go there. And cover cropping, the species you use, whether you mix your cover crops, when you plant them, whether you manage to interseed them with your growing cash crop, whether you manage to terminate that cover crop just before your next crop and create a lot of biomass, there's a lot of ins and outs, right? So some of the contention is about, well, how much can we really sequester? And there's still more work needed to really quantify what the highest potential is, because there's so much innovation happening in the space that, yeah, you can go to Comet Planner and get an average for the country of what a grass legume, what a grass cover crop will sequester on average per acre per year, and what a legume grass mix will sequester, and it'll give you an average, and that's a good conservative estimate. But I think actually my educated hunch is that there's the ability to sequester a lot more carbon from those practices than what we're currently providing as conservative estimates, because there's so much innovation happening. And one of the really key pieces in this space is that it's critical to implement systems, right? So we hear about soil health practices, and there's, for example, a lot of contention about whether no-till sequesters carbon, right? And if a farmer only stops tilling their soil, what they've done is they've stopped tilling their soil. They're not growing more plants, and plants are what sequester carbon. No-till itself doesn't bring in more carbon, but no-till stops the soil from losing as much carbon. So if we're bringing in more carbon and we're not losing as much, that's a win-win. So we want our farmers to adopt no-till. There are a tremendous number of benefits across the board of what no-till provides in terms of ecosystem services beyond carbon sequestration. But what we really want to do is build systems that build in cover cropping or some kind of way to have living plants in the system year round. We want to reintegrate animals. We want to bring agroforestry and silvopasture back into our systems. We want to stabilize the carbon that we add to our soils. There's massive amounts of compost available. There's massive amounts of other biomass available. There's an increasing desire to apply biochar, because when you char an organic product, you stabilize that carbon so that it lasts in the soil for at least 100, if not 1,000 years, instead of just a few years. And so you can photosynthesize a lot of carbon and essentially make something that's a little more like fossil fuel, right? You make it really stable, and then you add it to the soil, and that allows the soil to function even better and get to an even higher level of organic matter because of the amount of microbial habitat, ability to store more water, especially in particular soils. There's just a host of benefits. And so integrating all of these practices together, that's where the key is, and that's where a lot of the unknowns are, frankly. And so, yes, absolutely, regenerative practices do sequester carbon, and we do need to use them. They need to be part of the solution. I think the question is more, how do we get to the absolute highest potential in each soil type, in each production system, in each climate? And how does climate change itself influence the ability of soils to sequester carbon, right? As we get hotter, more of that carbon respires back out into the atmosphere, right? So we kind of need to counteract that fast so that we get overall to a gain. So those are some of the key issues in terms of technically how much can be sequestered. And then some of the other contentions are around, well, you know, what is actually possible given barriers to adoption. So now we're talking about things like economic barriers for farmers who have never done this before, who don't have the machinery that might be needed, who may not have access to the markets that might be needed when suddenly integrating an oat crop or a wheat crop, or never mind an agroforestry crop, back into the system, right? If they're reintegrating livestock, they need to have a whole different supply chain that they're accessing to be able to sell the livestock that they're now integrating into their system. And so markets tend to be an issue, social realities, right? You go to the coffee shop, and if you're the odd one out, that's really tricky, right? So what is the actual potential is contentious, partly because we're all people and we're all different, and there are these social aspects that influence what we do. There are markets that drive things, and there are policies that drive things. And that's the other key piece. There's a lot of contention around policy and what it is that, for example, the Farm Bill needs to say should be done, because the Farm Bill, frankly, is the largest piece of legislation that influences farming in this country. And just plug American Farmland Trust, the original white paper that got EQIP and CSP and ASAP ALE, used to be FRPP, to happen, came out of American Farmland Trust work. So that's pretty exciting, which is part of why I'm really excited to be here and work on that policy angle that's really critical to integrate with the science work that we're doing on this. There's a lot of impact to be made. And I think one of the key messages to everybody out there is that policy, it can often be very contentious, but one of the things that we're seeing not being as contentious is soil health. It seems like there's not as much divisiveness around soil health because all farmers are experiencing the detriments of degraded soil or the benefits of healthy soils. All farmers are experiencing, to some extent, the really harsh realities of our changing climate. And healthy soils provide more resiliency to our farming systems. So those are just some of the keys there. There's a lot of contentious aspects out there, but I think my key message would be, when you encounter divisiveness, find a way to understand the concerns on the other side and bring everybody in so we're all on the same page. I think all of us really care about the same thing. We want to keep living comfortably on this planet. And there are things that we can do about that. And I think it's much easier to get people on board when we can get down to basics of how's that farmer doing on their farm? And are they producing the food for us that we want to be able to have access to, and that we then do have access to?
Thanks for that. Like you said, I imagine that farmers, perhaps more than the average person, sees the impacts of climate change, right? And also, I think there is a moment now with what's happening in terms of energy costs, to be thinking about reducing dependence of the food system in agriculture on petrochemicals and
Absolutely.
fossil fuels. I want to turn to you, Dave. Bianca covered a lot of, I think, different ideas, but I'm curious, from your sense, and maybe it's just picking up on something she's already mentioned, what do you see as the sort of the biggest potential interventions, areas to focus on in terms of improving, addressing soil health considerations?
Well, I think what Bianca was saying in terms of a systems approach and thinking about it is hugely important. And to start with, I'll just echo everything she just said. It was just right on. But when you look at essentially the way scientists have tended to study soils, we tend to break down agronomic practices into single things, whether it's tillage, whether it's cover crops, whether it's manure, each thing being treated individually, in part because, as scientists, we like to break things into small pieces, see if we can understand them, and then get insight into the bigger picture. And it also works well with the life cycle of funding and graduate students and the whole research engine that drives science. It's more difficult to actually do systems level studies. And yet everything that I can take away in reading the literature on these subjects suggests that it's not just no-till, but it's no-till, cover crops. It's minimizing disturbance, keeping living plants growing in the soil. It's growing a diversity of crops, and that system of a new system of agriculture rooted in those principles is what's really needed to cultivate the beneficial life in the soil that really enhances carbon cycling, builds up soil organic matter, enhances fertility, reduces erosion. And so what I think one of the biggest barriers we have is sort of our philosophy of farming, how we think about the soil, how we think about the land. And we need to think about it as an ecological system that we can cultivate in the not plowing up sense, but cultivate in the sense of enabling and enhancing the biology in the soil. And we need basically an agricultural philosophy that puts the biology and soil ecology first. Soil chemistry and soil physics are incredibly important, but they are just pieces of a bigger puzzle. And we lost sight of the role of biology, I think, in the 20th century in terms of how we think about soils in agronomic systems. And so, when we think of a regenerative agriculture, I like to think of it as a style of agriculture that can build and enhance soil health over the long run as a consequence of intensive agriculture. And that means it's kind of a big tent kind of a definition in terms of the practices like biodynamic practices, which have some cultural oddities that go with them, but that are basically focused on building soil health. And, and the original conception of organic agriculture is very much rooted in building soil health, although there's some odd things permitted now under USDA rules that undermine that. But if we think about soil, if at the first level, it's how we conceptualize and think about soil. And if we develop a new philosophy of farming that's based on prioritizing practices that build soil health and empowering farmers to innovate as to what those practices actually are that work for them on their land, for their economy, for the crops they want to grow. To me, that's really the secret. And I've turned very much into an optimist on this issue. Back when I wrote Dirt, looking back at past societies and the effects on civilizations, it was really easy to be depressed about this issue. But the more regenerative farmers I've met and the more I've come to respect their ingenuity and their ability to adapt general principles, like the principles of soil health building, to the specifics of their farms, the more I've become impressed with how we could actually solve this problem. But it's got to work for the farmers as well as for the land for it to be sustainable in terms of farming. And I think it can, because if we can adopt a system that is based on regenerative principles that uses less of the costly inputs, less synthetic fertilizer, less pesticide, less fuel, those are some of the big costs for modern farming in the developed world and some of the barriers for modernization in the developing world. And if we can reduce those costs while maintaining harvests, that's a recipe for more profitable farms. And more profitable farms is a recipe for reviving rural economies. It's hard to actually identify the downside of building soil health. And I think that's partly why there's a lot of interest in it these days, is that even if it doesn't solve climate change or solve rural economy problems, it's a solution that can help across the board. And that's something that I would not have offered 20 years ago when I started thinking and writing about these issues. But when you start digging into them and you sort of work through what is known and where things are going, and how we now understand the relationship of farming practices to the health of the land, to our ability to grow crops, and actually to the nutritional quality of the food that we grow. They're all connected, and you can draw threads through that science. And that's basically what we've done, what Anne and I have done in the books that we've written, where if you look at Dirt, basically that was the first one that looks at the history of how we degraded land around the world and made the case for the need for a new philosophy of farming that is building on soil health. The Hidden Half of Nature, which my wife Anne Biklé and I wrote together after she restored fertility to the yard in our garden, and is all about the connections of microbial life, how the life in the soil that Bianca was talking about is really the engine that drives fertility, and the parallels between the relationships between soil life and plant roots and what goes on in our own gut. We've heard a lot about our own microbiome in the last few years, but you can think about what's the soil as the gut of a plant on the outside. It's essentially outsourced its digestive system to life in the soil and symbiotic relationships that are just in the inside out version of what goes on in our own bodies. Growing a Revolution looked at regenerative farming and how applying the principles of regenerative farming have worked for farms both on subsistence farms in West Africa, Central America, and also large industrialized farms. And those books all look at sort of how farming practices influence the state of the land. There's one other piece that I think is actually really important for thinking about this, and that's where Anne and I have gone with our new book, What Your Food Ate, which literally comes out next week. We're really excited that it's done. But it looks at whether or not these regenerative farming practices actually generate more healthful, more nutritious food, how the health of the soil translates up into differences in the mineral micronutrient content, the phytochemical content of our crops, and also how the way we feed our livestock, whether freely grazing out in an open range, eating plants eating green plants, or whether we feed them on grains, affects the fat balance in our meat and dairy in ways that actually translates over and influences human health. Now, the health connections on all these are really driven through chronic diseases rather than acute diseases for the most part. And the case that we make in What Your Food Ate is that regenerative farming, and if applied broadly, could actually help address the chronic disease epidemic around the world in terms of addressing mineral micronutrient deficiencies, phytochemical deficiencies. And what are phytochemicals? Well, when they get into our body, they serve as antioxidants, anti-inflammatories. They're things that we don't need to grow and to live, but that actually influence health. And so if we can start thinking, and back to your original question, about how the health of the land translates into the health of our crops, of our livestock, of us as individuals, and back to where I started on this whole issue, in terms of health of whole societies and ultimately planetary health for human civilization. If we can see those connections and linkages, we would treat the land differently, because it really is the foundation for all that. So I think one of the biggest barriers that, as a professor of geology, that I choose to work on is the big picture of how we look at the soil, how we think about it, and the way that provides a foundation for farming practices. We have an opportunity to really reshape our relationship with nature through how we farm and be able to support a large number of people going forward on this planet. But we're only really going to be able to sustain that if we rethink our relationship with the land. And put simply, the message of What Your Food Ate is what's good for the land is good for us too.
I really appreciate what you both said in terms of thinking about all of this in the context of systems, and it's not just biological systems, the relationship between soil systems and plants and, carbon in the atmosphere, our own, human systems, but even things like you talked about, Bianca, is just almost the social systems, right? Like thinking and recognizing the reality that people are in when they're practicing a certain way, or the conditions, economic conditions, or what have you, that are conducive to going one direction versus going in another direction. And it's something that we at PCI are often trying to focus on across a range of issues is thinking in systems, because we have, I think one of the challenges of the modern world when we've become so focused on specialization is we've lost those connections. So I really appreciate you both saying that. Now, Bianca, you showed us a visual of sort of this downward spiral. Can you show us what an upward spiral would look like?
Yes, I sure can.
Thanks.
Yeah, so, our goal really is to make our soil health management systems, our regenerative systems, our climate smart systems commonplace, right? We want that to be the conventional agriculture. So what does that look like, right? In terms of what are those intervention points for healthy soils? We need to integrate those full systems. And so what we do there is, well, I've got our 4 soil health principles here. If we increase biodiversity, we increase rooting, meaning increasing the presence of living roots in the soil and therefore living above ground matter for, as much of the year as you can possibly get it. Year round is best, right? Increase soil cover and decrease disturbance. So tillage, and as well as chemical and biological disturbance, whether that's overgrazing, whether that's over application of fertilizers, pesticides, you have it, right? We want to minimize disturbance while maximizing soil cover, rooting, and biodiversity. What does that do to our soils? How does that rebuild our soils is kind of the question here, right? So first of all, as we're increasing the amount of photosynthesis, we're going to get more soil organic carbon. And we're going to have more plants on the surface, more residue cover on the surface. That decreases crusting at the surface. It decreases the tendency of aggregates to fall apart as soon as a raindrop hits, because those aggregates are now protected at the surface. And that means we're starting to decrease compaction. We've got roots going deep into the ground, reshaping those pores. We're not disturbing those pores, right? So we're building a continuous pore system. And when you have the size of a pore, you actually cut to 1/16 the infiltration rate. That means if you double the size of a pore, now you've got 16 times the infiltration rate. So start imagining that, right? So now we've got more biological activity because we're really feeding that soil life. We're rebuilding our soil structure. We're rebuilding our aggregate stability throughout the soil profile. We're really allowing those roots to have a good home where they can really get into the soil much better. Now we're increasing infiltration. We're increasing the ability of the soil to drain excess water and actually to recharge groundwater also. We're getting less erosion. We're getting less ponding at the surface. We're getting more plant available water storage, because as that water infiltrates, as it starts seeping into all of those aggregates that are nicely being shaped, that all those roots have easy access to because the soil is soft, right? We're storing all that water. Roots are able to get deeper into the soil. All the water that manages to drain all the way deep into the soil because it's no longer running off, right? We're getting it to infiltrate. We're getting it to drain downward. We're getting it, the aggregates as sponges to soak up that water as it's coming in. We're storing up all that water. We can't make it rain, but we can manage our soil to turn into a really excellent sponge that infiltrates as much of that water as we can get. And, actually, studies have been done. I was just chatting with former employee Stan Boltz at NRCS. They did some really fantastic dynamic soil properties studies in South Dakota and measured the infiltration rates of cropland and better managed cropland, poorly managed cropland, grazing land, rangeland, and you can go all the way from infiltrating an inch of water in 2 minutes to it taking 1,200 minutes, right? That's the range of infiltration, and that's all management based, right? So that's the difference we're starting to get as we've got our 4 soil health principles really being integrated. So now our plants are growing excellently. That means they're sequestering a lot more carbon. They're photosynthesizing more. They're getting it all the way into the soil. They're growing more deeply into the soil. They're providing all sorts of yummy stuff to those microbes that they grow together with. And we're keeping more of our topsoil because it's not eroding because we've got the soil covered year round, right? So we're going back to what David was talking about, much more natural erosion rates that are sustainable because we're at that point building our soils as fast as or faster than they are eroding. So that's where we want to get to. We're increasing our nutrient cycling because we've got so much life in the soil that they're able to decompose that organic matter, make those nutrients back available to our plants. We've got fungi who are in combination with plants, really helping those plants have access to nutrients, or arbusca, mycorrhizal fungi in cropping systems, right? And so we're stimulating all that life. And what that does for the farmer is field condition resilience improves, right? So for example, a farmer can now get out into their field right after a rainstorm without compacting their soils because the soil is draining better. They're able to plant much better. They might not lose that planting window before the next rainstorm hits. They're going to get greater consistency in those field conditions. They're going to have greater predictability on their ability to do all of the various farm operations that they need to do. Now the inputs decrease, and we've already, David excellently summarized that. We've talked about how now we don't need as many inputs anymore, right? And those are costly for the farmer, whether those inputs are irrigation water or fertilizer or pesticides or more machinery after we've got what we need, right? There's just so many different inputs that are needed in agriculture, and a lot of them are then no longer necessary. We get better pest suppression. in those soils when we have biodiverse systems where that agro-ecosystem is really in balance and being well managed for excellent habitat. And so with that, we get better crop yields, we get better crop quality, we get better consistency of those yields year to year. We get better farm economic viability. If you want to look it up, soil health economic case studies by American Farmland Trust, we've got a number of them and there will be more of them coming. We will be working with NRCS and with partners across the country to develop a lot of these soil health economic case studies, and actually an economic calculator also, so that a farmer can go in and say, okay, if I'm going to adopt these practices, how soon until that pays off? At what level per acre will that pay off? Because that's one of the really key intervention points, right? If as a farmer whose business it is, you're feeding your family off your farm, you can't afford to make mistakes that are really big mistakes. You can't afford to just suddenly not have an income. And so any innovation, any of that experimentation has to be safe enough, right? So we have to be able to provide some of those estimates for economically what that's going to look like. And we have to provide guidance to farmers for how it is that they transition into that safely, maybe on a field at first and that kind of thing. So we're building farm resilience and we're getting all of the environmental benefits that we get with soil health, all the way from water quality and water quantity to carbon sequestration to improve climate change, air quality. Just think of the dust storms across the Southwest from the droughts, right? If we have our soils covered, once we can get to that, right? We can't make it rain in the middle of a drought. It's kind of a tough time to start this, but as farmers build these systems, they're not going to be as hard hit as they are right now when we have such degraded soils. So lots of hope here. There's our upward spiral. And in terms of the potential intervention points, there's these in terms of building these full systems, and that's really key. There are the economic approaches and really providing better data. I think that's a key point. We need more technical assistance for our farmers, right? Because our farmers depend on somebody, whether they read it somewhere and are innovative enough to try it out on their own, or whether they need somebody who's a peer or even somebody across the country who will guide them, who will answer their questions, who has something to say about the system that's relevant to them and what they might do. There's social science research that seems to show that farmer networks really allow for greater adoption, because when a farmer has access to another farmer or a whole network of farmers who are all transitioning, some of whom are more experienced, they can all learn from each other. So one of the things that AFT is doing, we're building these farmer networks. We've actually got some farmer consultants who we are basically paying to consult with other farmers to adopt these practices. We are tying networks across our farmer networks. So farmers from New York can provide assistance to farmers from Connecticut. We're learning from farmers in Vermont to provide New England assistance and so forth, right? So we're trying to build those networks and really help our farmers have more access. And another piece, a lot of our farmers, their primary one-on-one trusted advisor is their ag retailer. And so we really need to work with those ag retailers, because once ag retailers recognize how critical soil health is, and that there can be a business model where they provide technical assistance on how to adopt these systems, we need to build approaches that make that possible. Because if all of our ag retailers could counsel their farmers on how to do this, well, how much impact would we make, right? And then we need to bring non-operating landowners into the fold. And that's another space where AFT really does a lot of work, is really helping non-operating landowners understand the importance of soil health, helping those who own land through our various easements and work with those organizations through our National Ag Land Network to have access to soil health information so that they can influence the folks who rent from them, so that we can write that into leases where that's appropriate. So there's a lot of opportunities there. And then the policy opportunities, I think that's a really big lever, whether it's policy at the state level. A lot of states are developing state soil health programs, and there's a lot of opportunity in that. We are working on a policy scorecard system for state soil health policies that will be out next year, where states will be able to learn from each other what successes are being had in soil health policy in each state, so that we can transition, we can translate policies from one state to another. They can learn from each other. We can nationalize things that are really exciting and successful. And of course, there's the Farm Bill. I think there's really a lot of opportunity. The next Farm Bill is coming due 2023. We're working on it. the next one after that is 2028. That is too late. And so I encourage anybody who's interested in getting active in policy, and you can get on the AFT email list and you'll get action alerts from us. And we'll be working on the Farm Bill agenda. There's a lot of work happening at the state level where we can really influence soil health policy that then really drives resources available to farmers, support for farmers in various different ways at the state and national level, so that our farmers can adopt these systems.
I think you just addressed some of the questions we've gotten from folks in terms of how people can be part of the solution when they're not farmers, landowners themselves. And I think the policy front, you talked about the Farm Bill and other things on the policy side is clearly one way. I do want to we don't have a ton of time, but I want to get to some of the questions we've gotten. Some of them are trickier than others. I'm going to start with an easy one for you, Bianca, and that's just the name of the website you mentioned that had info on cover cropping.
Did I mention a particular website? I don't.
Yeah, it was something about calculating
soil health economic calculators.
Yeah, maybe
there are a lot of resources out there. In terms of our American Farmland Trust website has information on the soil health economic tools and case studies, and so you can find that if you Google American Farmland Trust. Also on cover cropping specifically, while at NRCS, I worked across a number of partners with colleagues at ARS and across universities. The Midwest Cover Crop Council has been in existence for a long time, but there wasn't that for either the Northeast or the South or the West. Now the country has 4 cover crop councils, so those who do cover crop and want more information, your regional cover crop council is one resource. The goal of those councils is to bring the knowledge together across the region, across universities, land grants, researchers of various sorts, farmers, industry, crop seed sellers, anybody across the space, governmental, state entities, nonprofits. And there's, in the next couple of years, a national cover crop decision support tool is coming that has been funded from NRCS and ARS now. So I know that's moving forward. Some of those tools are already available. The Midwest has had a cover crop decision support tool. So you would Google Midwest cover crop calculator. The Northeast has one, the Northeast cover crop calculator. There's many improvements that are about to happen to that one. There's also a nitrogen calculator for cover crop inputs for the east side of the country. That is now available. And I think that's available probably off of the Northeast Cover Crop Council website. So you'd be able to find that. That gives guidance on how much you can reduce your nitrogen inputs if you're growing different kinds of cover crops, and then depending on what systems you're in. So there's a lot of information out there, and there's a lot of information and calculators coming, and we're working across partners to build integration across those calculators. So that's really exciting. There's a lot happening in that space.
Great. All right, Dave, I'm going to throw a harder one at you. Does regenerative farming lead to reduced yield? If yes, with increasing population every day, is it possible to still practice regenerative farming? You're on mute.
Well, that's actually not too hard a question.
Oh, good.
All the farmers I visited in writing Growing a Revolution, the regenerative farmers, after they restored fertility to their land, they were out yielding their conventional neighbors. So the short answer is, yeah, there's not a trade-off there. The longer and somewhat more subtle answer is that there can be a transition period, right? So you can't just go straight from degraded land, cut it off of all inputs, and expect to get a big boost in yield, right? That's crazy. So there's a strategy that, to restoring land in terms of what you plant first, the sequencing of cover crops, and it would depend on the nature of your soil, the climate that you're in, the crops you want to grow, what are your cash crops, what are your cover crop preferences, and what's the experience of farmers in your region with regenerative techniques, because there's no reason to reinvent the wheel every time we start on every new farm, right? There's a lot of really good experience out there that can be drawn on to try and figure out, well, how to accelerate the transition. And there's a company I'm familiar with in Europe that is basically partnering with farmers and advertising that they will basically backstop any difference in profitability from the start in terms of adopting regenerative practices. But I've seen in the farmers I've interviewed, a couple year period of depressed yields in making the transition. But by depressed yields, we're not talking about 50%. We're talking about 5% kind of levels. So somewhat lower yields
Hmm.
for a couple years, but that the cost, the immediate reduction in input costs, more than makes up for the economic hit to the farmer. So when we look at it over the long run, we can't afford not to make the transition to regenerative practices because, yields on conventional farms have been stalling out for, a number of years now, a couple decades, if I'm getting the numbers right. And I'd lean on Bianca for the correct answer on that.
I think that's
But
right.
that's about right. Okay, so basically, if we continue to try and support ourselves with practices that degrade the ability of the land to support us over the long run, we're just digging the hole deeper. And so it's well worth making the transition. But the short answer is no. We can afford to go to regenerative practices across the board in terms of yield. We grow enough food now to feed the entire world if we distributed it equitably and we didn't put so much of it into cars and into cows in terms of grains. Cows are a wonderful tool for converting grasses we can't eat into meat and milk we can eat. They're a horrible tool for converting grains we can eat into food we can eat. There's a 10-to-1 loss there. And it turns out, what Anne and I write about in What Your Food Ate is that what we feed our livestock makes a huge difference to the nutritional profile of the fats that we get into our bodies. And to make to oversimplify a little bit, grass-fed livestock are going to have a much better omega-3 to omega-6 ratio than grain-fed livestock for a very simple reason. Grains are rich in omega-6s, which tend to be pro-inflammatory fats when they get into the human body, not exclusively, but as a gross generalization. And why do grains have a lot of omega-6s? Because omega-6s are fairly stable fats. It's what you want in a storage element in a plant. That's why plants make grains with omega-6s, because a grain is a storage element. Whereas photosynthetic leaves, green leaves that are key to photosynthesis, those have a lot of omega-3 fats. Why? Because they're very reactive fats. They're involved in photosynthesis. So depending on what we feed our livestock, they will have a very different nutritional profile for us. So, if we start thinking not just in terms of yield, but we think in terms of quality, and we think in terms of how will we grow large amounts of high quality nutritious food, it all points to regenerative agriculture over the long run in terms of the right strategy forward. So in my mind, the question is, how do we facilitate the transition so that farmers can get through both economically and in terms of yield, because we do need enough calories to feed everybody. We can't afford to sacrifice yield and to feed just a few of us. But I think that we can, with a new focus on not just quantity, but quality and quantity, see a way forward to not only feed the world, but nourish the growing world.
I mean, clearly that is a big question to answer, but it does seem like a systemic approach to answering that question would be key, right?
Yeah, and
that's all those.
And putting together the sort of the science behind that and both the argument and the evidence for it, that's really what Anne and I tried to do with What Your Food Ate. And there's one thing I will advertise is that we also put out a standalone document on our website, dig2grow.com, that has the 1,000 sources we relied on, the references we relied on for What Your Food Ate. And that's available as a free download. You don't have to buy the book to look at that. Nobody should ever have to compile that again.
Great. We just have a few minutes left. I want to give you guys a chance to sort of give some closing thoughts. I have a question here, which I think might be a relatable question for a lot of the folks who are following along, who are not necessarily in a situation where they're food growers, they're farmers. So I'm going to toss that question to you. You can answer that question as sort of your closing, or you could, if there's something else that you feel like, oh, I wish I had mentioned this, and you'd like to do that instead, let's do that. So I'm going to, here's a question. I'm going to start with you, Bianca. And the question is, how can we talk to people who do not live near soil in such a way that they are participants in our planet's future? In other words, how can we all be stewards of soil, even when we do not live where any is exposed?
That is an excellent question. And I mean, you can grow things even on your back patio. So I think that a lot of folks really can grow even just a little bit of food to get to know the process, right? Because a lot of people don't know where food comes from and should, because it's a key piece of that paradigm shift. I think there's a lot of different ways that people can get involved in soil health depending on who they are. The obvious one is for farmers, but then policymakers or those who influence policymakers have some big levers. Philanthropists or those who influence how philanthropists think. Those who can tell a good story to somebody who has money can allow them to put their money where we can solve this issue. Community planning, if you get involved in community planning, smart growth is critical, because if we keep expanding into the suburbs, what we take up is farmland, and then we no longer have it to grow on, and that very land now produces 50 to 70 times more greenhouse gases, and that means that that land is now majorly contributing to the climate change issue that we are trying to resolve by using our farmland to actually go the other direction. So we don't want to lose any more farmland. An excellent way to do that is through easements. And there are various, local community, state resources for those who may have land and want to put an easement on it. For those who have land, want to put an easement on it, don't have another farmer coming in, could be farmland, right? We have a buy, protect, sell program where basically American Farmland Trust helps establish easements so that that land can then be sold, maybe even to an underserved farmer who can produce, excellent crops for for that local community. So there's options there in terms of community planning. We want to support our farmers in any way that we can, support them in adopting those practices, support them in having access to land, support them in being economically viable, right? You can't have a farm if you don't have a farmer to farm that land. And so that's a critical piece. And, writers, again, those who like to write, you often don't even have to write your original thing. There's people all over who write really excellent stuff, and you can amplify it. You can amplify it on social media. If you amplify conversations like this, Montgomery's books, they're excellent. The work that American Farmland Trust does, the work that NRCS does, if you are buying your food from a local farmer, if you're not due, right, support your local farmer wherever you can. If you have access to a farmer and you start asking them questions about their practices and they express, oh, well, I might not make money doing it that way. Oh, I don't really know how to do that. Oh, I don't know what resources to go to, right? NRCS has really built up a soil health program, and there's a lot more resources there now, a lot more training available now through NRCS. And so any farmer can access NRCS through their local county office. So there's just a lot of resources, a lot of connecting. I think anybody can be a bridge in one way or other, right? You can help make those connections. You can help bring about understanding, because you never know what the person who you're going to talk to might then be able to influence just by understanding how critical it is that we make this transition to a new conventional agriculture that doesn't have all of these problems. So I hope that's a little bit helpful. Eat local food, and influence in all those ways.
Dave, what about you? Any thoughts to add to that question, or any other closing thoughts?
Boy, well, I think there's one other connection I think could be a big driver for helping spread the adoption of regenerative agriculture, and that's the recognition of essentially the connections to human health, and in a generalized, broad sense. And that's what we wrote about in What Your Food Ate, and the case that we try and make there. So I obviously would recommend people, share that message, share the case, get people to read, share the books. But if we think about agricultural policy as health policy, if we could get that across and grounded, that growing more healthy, more nutritious food, and a greater diversity of food, diversifying our diets, would be a big help. And we called the book What Your Food Ate for a very simple reason. It's a little different. We've all heard you are what you eat, right? And we all know that, our diet matters to our health just as much as exercise and our genes and the environment and chemicals that might be in it and so forth. But if we expand our thinking to include what our food ate as actually mattering to our health, and that we trace those connections through the book to try and make the case. It's complicated, of course. A lot actually affects our own health. But if we can add that to the constellation of things that we think about that actually influence our health, then people will be more likely to ask that farmer, what are your practices? To look for, buying food from regenerative sources. And, there's going to be arguments about what the word regenerative actually means and how it's defined and so forth. But if we take to heart the basic concept that farming practices that build soil health, that build the health of the land, that leave the land as healthy or better off as a consequence of farming as it was before, as the foundation for a new style of agriculture, that's going to help across the board.
Thanks for that. We are at time. I wish we had more time, to be honest. But I just want to express our gratitude to the two of you, Dave and Bianca, and everyone who signed up for this webinar, took the time to participate. I want to remind folks that we do have the second webinar in this series next week at the same time. I just want to suggest as well that you check out the work of American Farmland Trust. Check out David's books and other resources at digtogrow.com. We would love your feedback, so please look for a survey link I'll be sending to you via email shortly. And just as a thanks to our monthly donors and anyone who's able to donate $25 or more to support PCI's work, including doing webinars like this and websites like resilience.org, we're going to be sending recordings of both of these webinars and some additional resources to those folks. So again, thank you both. Thank everyone who joined us for this conversation, and let's keep digging on this issue. Sorry for the pun.